Paris, March 28, 1757. Cold air clings to the cobblestones of the Place de Grève. Smoke from torches curls like grasping fingers toward the morning sky. Thousands gather, silent and waiting, pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath the looming facades of stone. Some have travelled miles. Children perch on windowsills. Old men lean on canes. They've heard rumours of what is to come of flesh, fire, and horses' but whispers falter against the arrival of certainty. This will not be an execution. This will be something else entirely. At the centre of the square stands a wooden scaffold draped in solemn black. A man is tied there thin, trembling but unbroken. His name is Robert-François Damiens, once a common servant. Now, something else entirely. His hair is matted. His eyes flicker between dazed resignation and sudden sparks of defiance. To some, he looks mad. To others, haunted. Yet everyone knows, this is the man who raised a knife against the king. The act itself had been feeble, barely a scratch on Louis XV's side as he stepped into his carriage at Versailles. No attempt to flee followed, and when asked, why? Damiens spoke not of vengeance or treachery, but of sorrow. To make the king think, he muttered, about the unhappiness of his people. And for that, for daring to touch what was sacred, he would be torn apart, limb from limb, by horses. The punishment, écartèlement, belonged to France's distant memory, a ritual of divine retribution saved for regicides and traitors. It had not been performed in living memory. Executioners now leaf through old manuals, calling on ghosts of medieval jurisprudence to prepare for this one final pageant of royal wrath. But even as ropes were tightened and iron pincers made ready for flesh, there was no triumph in the air. No cries for blood, only a suffocating weight. Everyone had come expecting justice, or at least the kind they'd been promised by power for generations. But within these slow and terrible hours, something would change. Because what unfolded that day would not simply punish a manet, would strip bare the soul of a monarchy gasping at the edge of its age. In Damiens' broken body, the people would witness more than crime and consequence. They would see a mirror held up to the state, divine, spectacular, but rotting beneath the gold. This is the story of that day, and how, in the echo of one man's screams, an empire began to tremble. France, in the mid-18th century, was a kingdom veiled in ceremony and conviction, a place where the throne did not merely govern but sanctified. To defy the king was not to challenge a man, but to confront God himself. This was the age of the divine right of kings, a belief so deeply rooted that it shaped not just law and governance, but the very psyche of the people. Monarchs ruled by providence, and their authority flowed not from the consent of the governed, but from the heavens above. Louis XV, le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, sat atop this sacred order. Hey, heir to the Sun King's legacy, he inherited not only palaces, but the celestial claim that the king's body was untouchable, his will absolute. But by the 1750s, the glow of divine majesty had begun to dim. Behind the polished veneers of Versailles, whispers were growing. The well-beloved had become distant, distracted by mistresses and courtly intrigues. Starving mouths in the countryside no longer saw a father of the nation, but an emperor of excess. Still, the machinery of divine monarchy churned on, upheld by the church, by custom, and by fear. Priests preached obedience, judges defended the sacred, and executions became rituals of reaffirmation. In a sense, every public punishment was a catechism, a brutal sermon reminding the masses who wielded the sword and why. The law was an extension of the throne, and the throne was the footstool of God. But another wind stirred through the salons and taverns of Paris, quieter yet insistent. Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire began to question the very premise of inherited authority. They wrote about reason, rights, and the social contract, undermining word by word the foundational myth of divine rule. To their minds, rulership required consent, not sacraments. And so, France stood on a quiet fault line. Celestial order above, rising reason below. To strike the king, even in passing, was to strike at this entire edifice the gilded, decades-old illusion of divine justice and noble supremacy. This is the world Robert-François Damiens would step into. A world both gasping to uphold its sacred traditions and barely breathing beneath the pressure of coming revolutions. A kingdom where the act of a single man, armed with only a penknife, could tremble the throne more than any army. He was born in 1715, the same year Louis XIV died. A quiet omen, maybe, or just a cruel symmetry. Robert-François Damiens came into a world already trembling under weight it could no longer bear, but no one noticed the boy born in Arras to a tradesman's family. He was no prince, no philosopher, no firebrand. His life began like countless others in 18th century France, obscure, provincial, and disposable. By trade, Damiens drifted a domestic servant for magistrates, clerks, and lower bureaucrats of the parliaments. It was a vantage point that showed him power without ever granting him access to it. He fetched ink for men who wrote laws that suffocated the poor. He refilled wine for those who dined in rooms walled off from the cold and hunger outside. It was, perhaps, in these dim hallways and crowded taverns that the poison began to seep in. He listened, he watched, and slowly he changed. Accounts of Damiens describe a man neither violent nor cunning, but there was something unsteady in his manner, a religious fervour that bordered on derangement, a nervous energy behind his eyes. Some say he muttered prayers to himself. Others recall that he wept inexplicably. Was it madness? Or merely the desperation of a man who could no longer pretend he didn't see the injustice surrounding him? He was dismissed from several positions for erratic behaviour once, notably for speaking irreverently of the Church. Yet, unlike the radicals of the Enlightenment, Damiens was no clear thinker or theorist. He did not read volumes of Voltaire by candlelight. He mumbled scripture and stared at the sky. Still, a pattern emerges. Rebuke from civil authorities, estrangement from his family, solitary wanderings through the streets of Paris. He was a man unmoored. And then came the whispers. That the king was unjust. That the Parlement, once defenders of law, were now complicit. That God himself had turned his face away from France. Whether Damiens believed these things fully, or merely absorbed them like fog on his skin, remains unclear. He did not write manifestos. He left no diary. What little we know of his thinking comes from the frantic, feverish words he offered under interrogation, part revelation, part confusion. But one line, perhaps more than any other, whispered at the edge of history, endures, "I did it to make the king think about the unhappiness of his people." These were not the words of a revolutionary. They were the plea of a broken servant who, after a life of silence, screamed the only way he knew. January 5th, 1757. The chill outside Versailles clung to the marble like a second skin. Courtiers huddled near braziers, while inside, silk rustled and laughter rang the rhythms of royalty, carrying on as if unshaken by the burdens of the world. But among them moved a quiet figure, unnoticed, unescorted. Robert-François Damiens held something small in his pocket, a penknife, barely enough to wound, but sharp enough to pierce sanctity. Just after dusk, as Louis XV prepared to enter his carriage, Damiens pushed through the crowd. His movements weren't wild or rushed, they were calm, deliberate. He stepped forward and, with a single motion, drove the blade into the king's side. It was shallow. The wound would be sewn and healed in days. And yet in that moment, it felt as though the very spine of the kingdom had snapped. Witnesses screamed. Guards shouted. But Damiens did not run. Instead, he stood still, perhaps bewildered by his own act, perhaps waiting for punishment. When questioned, he gave no grand manifesto. Only this: that the king might consider the unhappiness of his people. Versailles spiraled into chaos. Was this an isolated fanatic, or the first spark of rebellion? Whispers filled the antechambers of conspiracies, foreign assassins, regicide plots. The sacred body of the king had been touched, violated. No ordinary blade could do that. In the minds of the monarchy and its defenders, this was not attempted murder. It was sacrilege. It was parricide. Louis XV survived, but changed. His famous indifference gave way to unease. He no longer allowed subjects to kiss his hand. His eyes, once languid with aristocratic boredom, now darted warily at public gatherings. The well-beloved, so named at the beginning of his reign, started to hear the heartbeat of discontent, though dimly, and too late. As for Damiens, he was ripped from Versailles and thrown into a dungeon where torments began long before any formal sentence. His statements were erratic, his logic fragmented. Sometimes he spoke of God's will, other times of judges, injustice, or simply the people. It was never clear if he acted from lucidity or madness. But one thing was certain. This act had punctured a myth. The untouchable king had bled. For a moment, a flash of steel and a drop of blood, the divine aura was broken. The crowd would talk of miracles, the court of vengeance. But history would remember something else, that even tyranny can flinch. The trial of Robert-François Damiens was not a search for truth. It was a performance, rehearsed over centuries, now reaching its crescendo with one shaky man at its centre. He entered the Palais de Justice, not as a defendant in any modern sense, but as a sacrificial object, a man already judged. The charge levied against him was parricide, not merely attempted murder, but the highest conceivable treason, an assault on the father of the French people, the king himself. A crime so grave it demanded the most sacred of punishments, dismemberment by horses, écartèlement. Behind the solemn marble walls and draped chambers of the Paris Parlement, robed magistrates sat in stern silence. Their powdered wigs swayed slightly as they recited statutes not as rational deliberations, but like rites from a sacred text. There was no room for ambiguity. To prick the king's flesh, even with a penknife, even causing only a minor wound, was to pierce the divine fabric that held the monarchy together. Damiens offered no defence that satisfied them. His statements were erratic. Some days he claimed it was political, other days spiritual. Often, he simply said nothing. To the Parlement, this disjointed testimony did not complicate the conclusion, it confirmed it. Lunacy, heresy, treason, it hardly mattered. He had violated the sacred body, and so his own would be unsacred in return. For observers at the time, including Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, the legal process was troubling for what it revealed. Not an attempt to understand a desperate act from a desperate man, but an exercise in preserving an idea, the sanctity of monarchy through spectacle. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, cloaked in legal theatre, a sentence born not from deliberation, but obligation. Even the execution method was a relic called forth in dread rather than justice. Écartèlement hadn't been used for decades. It had fallen out of practice, not for lack of crimes, but for its sheer cruelty. Yet now, faced with this challenge to divine kingship, the court exhumed the practice as a statement. The laws of royal France still ruled, still had teeth, and they could still tear. In the echoing style, once of the court, the decree was read. Damiens would suffer publicly, chaotically, painfully. Not for what he had done, but for what he had dared to symbolize. His sentence was not a response. It was a warning, a reminder that to strike at the crown was to invite the wrath of history's oldest gods. Fear, ritual, vengeance. March 28th, 1757. The Place de Grève Normally, a hub of daily commerce and murmured gossipice, now a vast arena swollen with people. The square is edged with curious citizens. Merchants shuttering their stalls early, nobles peering from balconies, and fishwives elbowing for a better view. The murmur of anticipation rises and falls like the tide. Children cling to their mothers. Some try to climb higher, away from the coming horror. In the centre, Robert-François Damiens stands, chained and trembling, barely more man than symbol by now. His thin frame shakes in the chill morning air, stripped to a linen shirt, face pallid, eyes darting flashes of fear, defiance, prayer. All around him, instruments of medieval cruelty glint beneath the pale sun. Iron tongs, branding bars, flasks of boiling oil and molten lead wait in solemn preparation. 4 great draught horses are tethered at the corners, muscles restless, hooves scraping nervously against the flagstones. Even they seem reluctant. The executioners begin with ritual agony. Pincers bite into his chest and thighs, peeling skin in blackened curls. Damiens screams a sound that startles even those accustomed to the gallows. Hot oil is poured into his wounds, followed by molten lead and burning pitch. When they sear his hand, the one that held the blade, he convulses, the limbs twitching for mercy no one will grant. Yet through blood and ash, he murmurs fragments of prayer and protest. Garbled Latin, the names of saints, half-coherent pleas for the king to remember his people's pain. Then comes the ancient sentence. Dismemberment by strength of horse. His arms and legs are securely tied, cords pulled taut from trunk to hoof. The executioner gives the signal. The horses pull. Nothing. Another signal. They rear, strain their sinews to the cracking point. The crowd shifts from eager anticipation to stunned silence. The human body, stubborn in its unity, will not yield. Minutes become agonizing hours. Blood leaks into the paving stones. The executioners, normally stoic, grow frantic, sawing at joints, hacking muscle, guiding the tearing by blade. At last, with a sickening groan, limbs begin to separate. One leg, then another. His torso slumps, steaming in the cold air. Many in the crowd turn away, some faint, others weep openly. A baker's apprentice, no more than 17, whispers to no one, "Is this justice or sin?" Above it all, in a palace far removed from the cries below, the monarchy's throne trembles if, only slightly. The crowd had hushed by now. The sharp clangors and murmurs, the flutter of anticipational, had evaporated under the crushing weight of what they had seen. Damiens, or what remained of him, was still alive. Pieces of flesh torn open but not torn off, limbs still resisting dismemberment. The horses were lathered in sweat, refusing to pull anymore. The executioners conferred nervously, faces pale. The scene wasn't proceeding as legend prescribed. The justice of kings had become a mechanical failure. Among the murmuring crowd, a woman wept openly. A man turned away, gripping the hand of his son who had covered his face. A baker's apprentice muttered a prayer under his breath, not for the king, but for Damiens. For the executioner, skilled in rope, blade, and weight, this was not a punishment. It was a desecration. He had carried out his role in silence for years. Efficient hangings, clean beheadings. But now, watching this man scream himself hoarse as he hacked through tendon to help the horses along, something inside him cracked. His hands didn't tremble, he had trained them not to butt. His conscience did. This was not justice. This was ritual cruelty. Damiens, though barely lucid, began repeating fragments of prayer. "O Lord, have mercy!" Moments of clarity sparked in his half-glazed eyes. He cried out for water. None was given. He asked to see a priest. No one responded. At that moment, his suffering seemed to transcend crimite, was something primal, animal, human. Word of the execution's horror spread before it even ended. A carriage bearing news reached Versailles by dusk. Madame de Pompadour turned ghostly when she heard. It is said that Louis XV, usually unshaken by pain, provided it wasn't his own paced in silence for hours. Blood had been spilled in his name, and even he couldn't meet its gaze. Elsewhere, enlightenment salons buzzed not with triumph, but shame. Voltaire, in whispered outrage, wrote to a friend, "Is there a corner of hell more deserving than this square of Paris?" The public spectacle had aimed to reaffirm trust in divine justice. Instead, it unravelled the illusion. Damiens didn't say anything profound before he died, but he didn't need to. The horror spoke for him. No king, no robe of law could decorate this act with righteousness. In the stunned silence that followed it was not just a man who had fallen apart, but the belief that power lived untouchable by conscience. The air in Paris did not clear for days. Though Damiens was gone, his body scattered to fire, and Windy's execution lingered like the scent of burned iron and wet rope. Whispers carried across cobblestones and banquet halls alike, finding ears in palace chambers and taverns. What was meant to be the unquestionable wrath of royal justice had instead brought something unspoken into the open: doubt. In the heart of the monarchy, tremors began to stir. Court officials, once prideful enforcers of tradition, muttered in private about the savagery they sanctioned. Madame de Pompadour reportedly collapsed at the details, retreating from court life in grief and illness. Louis XV, so often detached, flinched at the mention of Damiens thereafter, wound more lasting than flesh. The king, for all his divine garments and gilded halls, had been touched not just by a blade, but by the gaze of a tortured subject who confronted him with the pain of a nation. Far beyond Versailles, foreign diplomats returned home with shaken voices and ink-laden journals. Across Europe, the tale of the man torn by horses seeped into salons and parliaments, fueling a growing unease with the old order. Enlightenment thinkers, chief among them Voltaire, seized the moment. In scathing prose, they held Damiens not as a monster, but as a mirror reflecting the cruelty of systems that devour their own people in the name of justice. In pamphlets passed from hand to hand, at candlelit tables in Paris and Geneva, a new narrative emerged. Damiens was not merely a criminal, but a symbol of warning. The monarchy, long upheld as sacred and immutable, now looked brittle, even ridiculous. Philosophers dared ask, if such violence is necessary to protect a divine king, then what divinity is left? Quiet reforms began to tremble beneath the surface. The ancient punishment of drawing and quartering was never used again in France. Lawyers questioned the pageantry of pain. Judges wrestled with a law that seemed more medieval than moral. Executions began to withdraw from public theatres, slipping behind prison walls and into the realm of bureaucratic inevitability. But some wounds, once opened, fester. For many among the common folk, what they witnessed in the Place de Grève was not justice, it was vengeance dressed in robes. In Damiens' agony, they caught a glimpse of their own voicelessness. And though the revolution was still decades away, its breath could be felt in the silence that followed his scream. In the days and weeks that followed Damiens' execution, the tremors radiated far beyond the Place de Grève. What was meant as the ultimate display of royal retribution, a frightful monument to the sanctity of the crown, became instead a mirror showing France, a reflection of itself it could no longer ignore. The punishment had been carried out with precision, and yet the message unravelled. Damiens, a man of no consequence in life, had become something more in death, not a villain, not a martyr in the traditional sense, but evidence. Evidence that the old methods no longer produced order, only revulsion. Foreign ambassadors carried accounts of the execution back to their courts, where nobles and ministers recoiled not in triumph, but in disbelief. Madame de Pompadour, upon hearing the grotesque details, reportedly turned pale and retreated from public view. Even Louis XV, the victim of Damiens' feeble blade, seemed to wither further, his confidence shaken, his divine aura tarnished. The symbolic body of the king had been violated once by a knife, but it was the aftermath royal system's own response that left a deeper wound. What emerged in the wake of Damiens' death was not unity under royal authority, but growing disquiet. Writers like Voltaire pounced on the story not to defend the assailant, but to question the machinery that had turned a confused act of protest into a medieval horror. What justice is this, they asked, that punishes a wound that barely bled with torments that rival the fires of hell? People whispered about it in salons and back alleys, in cafes and churches. More than the crime itself, it was the state's reaction that sowed the seeds of doubt. If justice could be this cruel, was it still justice? If a nobody's hand could expose the cruelty of the crown, how sacred was it, truly? Damiens had asked the king to think of the unhappiness of his people. That plea had been muffled under screams, buried beneath the gallop of horses. But it would echo. In time, the people would think for themselves. They would remember the blood-soaked square, the smoke, the silence. They would ask if the man who died screaming had, perhaps, been the first to voice what many felt but feared to say. His cries faded, but the questions lingered. And slowly, as the century wound toward revolution, those questions would become demands. Silence hangs like morning mist over what was once the Place de Grève. The crowd has long since dispersed. The wooden platform has been swept clean. The screams faded into rumour, into memory, into history. And yet, something lingers in the air, the faint breath of a moment that refuses to die. Robert-François Damiens was no hero. He wasn't a revolutionary or a philosopher. He was a servant, flawed, troubled, and ordinary. But in aiming a feeble blade at the body of a king, he sliced through something far more significant: the illusion that absolute power could remain eternal, unchallenged, divine. His act, clouded by confusion and desperation, was fleeting. But its consequences stretched far past the blade's shallow wound. The way he died, the grotesque tableau carved into flesh and time, did not solidify royal authority as intended. Instead, it exposed its fragility. A monarchy, believed sacred, was reduced to spectacle. A criminal, meant to vanish into infamy, became a symbol, a martyr, not of cause, but of catastrophe. His screams echoed not just through the streets of Paris, but through the salons of the Enlightenment, and into the whispers of revolution yet to come. Those who watched the judges, the spectators, the executioners themselves were changed. Each saw something different. Divine justice served, justice perverted, or justice collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty. Madame de Pompadour would shudder behind embroidered curtains. Voltaire would dip his quill into ink and fire. And the people would remember. Not his name, perhaps, but what he endured. History often pivots not on grand triumphs, but on quiet ruptures, a single moment where the world briefly reveals its seams. Damiens was such a moment. His is the story of a man already lost, who became a torch not by strength or vision, but by being consumed. What was burned was not just his body, but the credibility of a throne. What remained was embers of doubt, of rage, of awakening. We look back now not to romanticize his act, nor to glorify what came after, but to understand that power, when built atop suffering and silence, is always seconds away from unraveling. One man, one moment, and the end of an era that had long outlived its reason.